Welcome to Mystery Cafe, your ultimate stop for gripping detective stories, chilling mysteries, and unforgettable investigations. Here, every video serves a fresh dose of suspense, shocking twists, and cases that challenge your inner detective. From classic whodunits to modern crime stories, we bring the world of mystery straight to your screen, where every clue matters and no secret stays buried for long. Before we start unraveling today's mystery, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa. Drop your country, city, or stay in the comments, and let's see how far the Mystery Cafe family reaches. Magnifying glass tilted right.
Crime and Counterfeiters: The Great Treasury Mystery. Chapter 1: The Uneasy Dollar. The first thing Allan Pinkerton noticed about the bill was not how fine it looked, but how confidently it lay upon the counter, a lazy king among coins. The grocer on Lake Street had set it down as though it stung him, yet to any hurried eye it might have passed as ordinary currency. The paper had the proper crispness, the ink a sober black, the engraved eagle ready to take flight. Only the attitude of the thing was wrong, too sure of itself, too composed, as if it had never taken an honest breath. Pinkerton stood with his hat brim shadowing his eyes, listening to the grocer's hushed explanation. "They come in twos and threes," the man said, "from strangers and from men I thought I knew. When I take them to the bank, the teller taps the counter once and looks at me like I've stolen my own cabbage." He put a hand to his apron, twisting the cloth. "I cannot afford shame, Mr. Pinkerton. Not for $1, nor for 10. He lifted the bill in 2 fingers and held it to the window. The winter light of Chicago sharpened the ink lines but lent no confession. Pinkerton knew that a false dollar was never merely paper and print, it was a promise uttered by a liar to a city. And the liar, protected by distance and by fear, grew richer while decent men grew anxious in their counting rooms. He handed the note back. "Where did this one come from?" "A stranger," the grocer replied. "He bought coffee and salt pork and asked after the post." A civil tongue, but there was something about his boots, mud from country roads, not city alleys. Pinkerton let that settle. Across the street, a dray rumbled by and the horse's breath unfurled into the cold like steam. A boy darted from a doorway with newspapers held high, rail expansion, wheat prices, a riverboat sunk on the Ohio. The city grew by the day. Where growth led, confidence must follow, and where confidence walked, counterfeiters stalked behind. "Send word to me if you see the man again," Pinkerton said. He tipped his hat and stepped into the bright chill. He had come at the request of a clerk from the Treasury, a practical fellow with a cramped hand who wrote that suspect bills had begun to travel west like a fever. The nation's coins and notes were already a patchwork, and the swindlers exploited every seam. In that letter, the clerk had added a line in a different ink, as if to whisper across miles, "There is talk of a skilled engraver, lately of Ohio. Beware perfection. It is the counterfeiter's favorite disguise." Pinkerton walked Lake Street with that warning in mind. He paused for talk that sounded like gossip but was, to him, the river of small intelligence a city cannot help but produce. A porter at a hotel spoke of a gentleman who paid in fresh notes and disliked change in coin. A seamstress swore she saw a man pass 2 identical 5s at the theater, with identical creases besides. A bookseller confessed he had stopped taking large notes altogether, he would rather anger his customers than anger his wife. Thread by thread the rumors stitched themselves into cloth, the false money came regularly, from hands too ordinary to notice, yet from some hand at the very start that was not ordinary at all. At the corner of Clark, he entered a telegraph office where the stove gave a companionable heat. "Any messages for Pinkerton?" he asked. The clerk, whose spectacles seemed permanently fogged, nodded and passed over a typed sheet. Reports had arrived from Ohio, towns near Cincinnati complaining of a new style of counterfeit, clean as a Sunday collar. Pinkerton traced a route on the map hung behind the counter: Cincinnati to the river, upriver to Louisville or down to St. Louis, then inland by peddlers and freight, scattered like seeds. Chicago, with its money-hungry merchants and rough edges, would be an easy field to sow. He thanked the clerk and returned to the street, the map vivid in his mind. Experience had taught him that a villain's first mistake was pride and his second, routine. If the bills were moving along a pattern, the men moving them would leave indentations he could find: favorite boarding houses, certain livery stables, a particular barkeep who did not ask questions. He began with the stables. At the first, a pale mare shook her head as though disagreeing with the cold. The stableman, wiping his hands on a rag that had lost its original color, told Pinkerton of a traveler with a new black coat, country boots, and a reluctance to look anyone in the eye. Paid in a fine 5, the man said, squinting, and wanted the change all in silver. Seemed to like the sound of it. At the second stable, there was mention of a hired rig sent without a driver to a farmhouse west of the city. Payment had been made in advance, which always made men less curious than they should be. Pinkerton marked the direction and thanked the keeper with a nod that promised future custom. In the afternoon he visited a bank where the teller, a severe gentleman with thin hair combed like an argument, received him with professional frostiness that melted when Pinkerton laid the suspicious bill on the counter. They bent over it together, the teller murmuring about plate depth, border work, and fibers in the paper. "It is good," the man said at last. "Too good. Whoever cut the plate knows his business better than some honest men." Pinkerton's mouth twitched. That is what makes him dangerous. He asked to see the bank's drawer of confiscated bills. The teller brought a tin box lined with envelopes. Each envelope bore a date and a name: merchant, hotel, butcher, saloon. Pinkerton examined the handwriting, the ink, the sameness of the letters. Habits make signatures even when signatures are false. He did not yet find the flaw that would make the entire enterprise visible to him, but he left with a weight of paper knowledge that any lesser man would have mistaken for certainty. Evening gathered itself out of the alleys. Snow threatened but did not yet commit. Pinkerton turned toward his office, a modest set of rooms above a cooper's shop. The stair creaked in paragraph lengths, an old friend. On his desk lay ledgers, spyglasses, 2 letters from clients who wished he would hurry, and a pair of gloves still damp from the day's weather. He set the grocery bill upon the blotter and sat in silence, listening to the barrel-maker below shape staves with a rhythm older than Banks. He wrote out what he knew and, more importantly, what he suspected. Notes traveling by routine. A craftsman's hand behind the plates. A trail that ran toward farmland and the suburb roads. A preference for obtaining silver in exchange, men who wanted hard money to move in their own circles. Each line led to the same blank, the origin. Paper and ink must rest somewhere. Presses must hum in some cellar under a blameless roof. He could feel the ring out there, breathing like a thing asleep, regular, warm, careless because it had not yet been woken by a shout. He blew out the lamp and let the office go dark, thinking of the grocer and his pinched pride, of the teller's reluctant respect for a criminal skill, of a city trying to march forward while someone tugged at the hem. To defend a city, one must first listen to it dream. Tomorrow he would travel the western road to where a black-coated stranger had wanted silence and silver. Tonight he sharpened his pencil. The uneasy dollar slept between 2 pages of his ledger like a pressed leaf. Awaiting spring, or fire. Chapter 2, The Merchant's Secret. The morning after his notes were set down, Allan Pinkerton dressed plainly in a woolen coat, took his cane, and walked west along Randolph Street toward the district of merchants and shopkeepers. Chicago woke early in winter, carts rattling against frozen cobbles, stevedores shouting by the river docks, women with shawls gathered at bakery doors. The city, for all its clamor, spoke to Pinkerton in whispers: what was being bought, who was prospering, who had gone to ruin, and sometimes, if a man listened shrewdly, which coin rang false on the counter. Pinkerton carried the memory of that counterfeit bill like a nail in his shoe. It had pointed him toward a name mentioned by two different men the evening before, the same man, though neither had known the other's tale. Henry Calder, a merchant in dry goods. Calder's name was not disreputable, nor was it celebrated. He moved in the middling circle of Chicago commerce, a man noticed for keeping his doors open late and his accounts private. The shop front stood on a busy stretch, its windows stacked with bolts of cloth and boxes of imported tea. Above the doorway hung a gilt sign painted with sober letters, H. Calder and Company. The man himself emerged as Pinkerton approached, a heavy-set fellow with neat whiskers and a waistcoat a shade too grand for his surroundings. He carried himself with the air of one accustomed to better recognition than he received. Pinkerton stepped aside, hat lowered, and observed. Calder handed a small brown parcel to a young courier waiting at the curb. The boy tucked it under his arm, glanced left and right, and set off at a brisk pace toward the alleys beyond. Calder watched him go for a moment, then re-entered the shop. The parcel was nothing extraordinary, brown paper, tied with common twine. But Pinkerton had learned long ago that ordinary wrappings often concealed extraordinary ruin. He waited until the courier turned the corner, then followed at a patient distance, allowing the crowd to serve as camouflage. The boy moved quickly, taking turns with the instinct of one who had rehearsed the route. Past the warehouses, past a row of lodging houses, down streets where coal smoke lay thick enough to taste, until at last Pinkerton lost sight of him in the shuffle of wagons and drays. He returned, annoyed but not discouraged. The quarry had not vanished into mist, he had entered a door somewhere, and doors, however many, could be knocked upon later. For now, the merchant himself merited attention. Inside the shop, Pinkerton found order bordering on ostentation. Shelves rose to the ceiling, laden with fabrics, canned goods, and imported luxuries. A pair of clerks moved busily between customers, tallying accounts with pencils. Calder stood behind the counter, smiling with an ease too carefully rehearsed. Pinkerton removed his gloves. "Good day, Mr. Calder." The merchant's eyes flicked to him with mild suspicion, then softened into courtesy. "And to you, sir. Might I interest you in cloth, perhaps? We've a fine shipment from the East, best muslin at a fair price." Pinkerton leaned upon his cane, as if weary from travel. "My interest is not in muslin today, but in information. I am Allan Pinkerton." He watched the reaction closely. Calder's smile did not collapse, but it strained. "Pinkerton, the detective? So I have been called." Pinkerton's voice was calm, almost courteous, yet in its calmness lay pressure. "Merchants on Lake Street speak of strange notes entering circulation. Your name arose as one who might advise me." A pause. Calder folded his hands atop the counter, a gesture that seemed intended to still their fidgeting. "I hear talk, as all men do. But I keep my dealings proper. Ask any of my customers, they'll tell you my accounts are sound." "Perhaps." Pinkerton let his gaze drift across the shelves. "Yet I saw you hand off a parcel this morning. Brown paper, twine. To a young courier." The merchant's eyes narrowed just slightly, a man gauging how much was known and how much was guessed. "A parcel of cloth," he said at last. "My business is trade. I send goods, I receive goods. Is there crime in that?" Pinkerton's mouth twitched faintly. Only if the cloth turns to silver somewhere along the way. He said nothing more, letting silence do the labor of interrogation. Calder cleared his throat. Chicago is full of envious tongues. A man cannot prosper without some neighbor whispering he has cheated. True enough, Pinkerton replied. Yet whispers have a habit of leading me to doors worth opening. Consider this conversation a courtesy. If I return, it will not be for muslin. With that, he touched the brim of his hat and departed, leaving Calder with a face caught between indignation and unease. Back on the street, Pinkerton considered what he had seen. Calder was no common fool. His denials were too careful, his indignation too measured. More telling than his words had been the flicker of caution when confronted with the parcel. A man unburdened by guilt would have named its contents with easy certainty. Calder, however, had weighed his answer like coin in the palm. Pinkerton walked the length of the block and paused near a lamppost. He took a notebook from his pocket and jotted down impressions. Calder's whiskers trimmed weekly, waistcoat new, shoes resoled yet polished, signs of a man with steady income, perhaps steadier than his trade alone would grant. He wrote too of the courier, his age, his pace, the confidence in his step. Confidence comes not from errands once performed, but from errands repeated. The next hours he spent in quiet inquiry among Calder's neighbors. A tobacconist recalled that Calder took in more cash than any dry goods merchant nearby, though his customers were not so numerous. A woman who sold ribbons whispered that Calder had a way of paying his suppliers in full, always on time, even when others struggled with debts. It is as though he has a spring that never runs dry, she said, eyes narrowing. At dusk, Pinkerton sat in a tavern opposite the shop, nursing a single glass while watching Calder lock the door. The merchant lingered a moment on the step, glancing down the street as if expecting company, then disappeared into the gathering dark. No courier came this time. Perhaps the morning's delivery had been the important one. Pinkerton tapped his glass thoughtfully. The pieces were not yet enough for a picture, but they formed an outline, a merchant too prosperous for his custom, a parcel whose purpose was concealed, a courier vanishing into alleys with the speed of a swallow. There was more behind Calder's gilt sign than bolts of muslin. As night deepened, Pinkerton returned to his office. On the desk lay the counterfeit note he had pressed between his ledger pages. He set it beside the fresh impressions of Calder and the courier. In the stillness, he could almost hear the hum of a press hidden beneath some farmhouse floor, sending false wealth into honest hands. The uneasy dollar had found a patron. Henry Calder, merchant of dry goods, was no mere shopkeeper. He was a gate through which counterfeit currency passed, as smoothly as cloth across a counter. The challenge now was not to prove his guilt, that would come in time, but to discover where the road of parcels and couriers finally ended. Pinkerton sharpened his pencil again. The hunt had begun in earnest. Chapter 3, The Printer's Mark. The counterfeit bill lay under the lamplight on Pinkerton's desk, stubborn as a silent witness. For all its fine lines and confident ink, there had to be a flaw, however minute. A craftsman's pride always left a mark, and pride was a noisier thing than criminals believed. Pinkerton leaned closer, the lamp turned low so the shadows fell sharp against the engraved lines. He ran a gloved finger just above the surface, tracing the eagle's outstretched wing. The bird was majestic, yes, but something about the feathering disturbed him. The strokes were too symmetrical, too deliberate. Real engraving bore the slight hesitation of a human hand, this bore a perfection that was itself imperfect. He pulled from a drawer a magnifying glass, its brass rim dulled from years of service. Through the lens, he saw it. On the eagle's left wing, one feather was fractionally longer than its twin, a sliver out of place. To the bank teller, the grocer, the man in the street, it meant nothing. To Pinkerton, it was the signature of a plate, repeated with each impression. He sat back, the weight of discovery pressing against his thoughts. Whoever had cut this plate was no amateur. The flaw was not incompetence but inevitability. Every hand, however skilled, left its own grammar upon the work. He made a note in his ledger, engraver, trained, precise, yet mortal. Find the hand, and you find the ring. By morning, Pinkerton was in the streets again, searching for men who knew presses and inks the way a farmer knew soil. He began at the print shops, presenting himself as a curious tradesman with an eye for paper. At Miller's printworks, he watched journeymen feed sheets into the heavy iron presses, listening to the rhythmic thump and hiss. He asked after work lost or stolen, engravers who had vanished, apprentices dismissed. Marcus Vane, a red-eyed pressman muttered, rolling tobacco between his fingers. Best hand with a burin I ever saw. Cut portraits like they'd breathe at you. But he drank too hard, fell into debts. Disappeared 3 years ago, just after a warehouse fire in Cincinnati. Pinkerton's gaze sharpened. The name carried weight. He remembered it from Treasury whispers, half-rumors passed along telegraph wires. And no one has seen him since. The pressman spat into a bucket. Not in daylight. At another shop, a journeyman, drunk on cheap gin, whispered the same name with a tremor of admiration and fear. Vane had been an artist, they said, but the sort who found more profit in shadows than in galleries. He could cut a plate so fine a banker would swear upon it in church. If counterfeit notes of uncanny perfection now circulated in Chicago, Marcus Vane was a ghost returned to haunt the economy. Pinkerton knew better than to accept rumors without proof. He wanted paper, ink, or plates, something tangible. He went next to papermakers, mills reeking of pulp and dye. A foreman confessed that sheets of high-quality linen paper had gone missing months earlier, vanishing from shipments bound for honest publishers. Could be the river swallowed them, the man said, but his tone lacked conviction. Paper did not drown itself. By evening, Pinkerton's coat was dusted with paper flecks and soot. He returned to his office with a handful of impressions. Vane the engraver, vanished but whispered of, missing paper of uncommon quality, a bill whose flaw pointed to a single craftsman's hand. He set the counterfeit note beside genuine ones borrowed from the bank. He examined them under glass until his eyes watered, noting differences so fine they would mean nothing to any man but him. There was an elegance to Vane's crime. The lines were bold yet restrained, the borders neat, the portraits almost noble. A man could almost respect such skill, if it were not bent to poison. Counterfeiting was more than theft, it was the corruption of trust, the silent eroding of a nation's faith in its own word. To Pinkerton, that was more heinous than any robbery by pistol. Still, skill left traces. Vane had studied under someone, worked alongside someone, quarreled with someone. Pride demanded audience, even if only among rogues. Pinkerton decided his next step would be to speak not to tradesmen but to those who trafficked in whispers, tavern keepers, gamblers, ex-convicts who traded rumor like currency. That night he entered a saloon thick with smoke, where men hunched over cards and glasses. He took a seat in the corner, ordered a whiskey, and listened. Patience was his most faithful tool. He let the talk drift over him, snaring fragments. Smooth bills, clean as factory steel. An artist with a grudge against banks. A man named Vane, or so they say. One drunk laughed bitterly. I saw his work once. Finest counterfeit I ever lost money on. If he's back, then God help Chicago's tills. Pinkerton left without revealing himself, his hat pulled low. The river wind bit at his face as he crossed a bridge, the ice groaning beneath. He thought of Vane somewhere in the sprawl, cutting plates by lantern light, each stroke a betrayal carved into steel. By the time he reached his office again, midnight had settled heavy upon the city. He poured himself a measure of whiskey, not for warmth but for thought. Marcus Vane was no longer a rumor, he was a thread woven through too many stories, too many missing shipments, too many whispers in smoky rooms. The flaw in the eagle's wing was his unholy signature. Pinkerton set his glass aside and opened his ledger once more. He wrote. Marcus Vane, engraver. Last seen Cincinnati, vanished after fire. Debt, drink, talent. Suspected in current counterfeit ring. Paper missing from mill supports theory of organized supply. Trail must lead to printing press hidden in farmhouse or warehouse. Must infiltrate operation. He closed the ledger, extinguished the lamp, and sat in the darkness, listening to the distant rattle of wagons in the night. Somewhere in Chicago, a man carved false promises into steel. Somewhere, presses thumped like a secret heartbeat, printing ruin disguised as prosperity. Pinkerton knew what must come next. To catch Marcus Vane, he would need to leave behind the city's chatter and step into the shadows themselves. If the counterfeit notes bore a craftsman's mark, then Allan Pinkerton would follow that mark to the very den where ink, paper, and ambition conspired against the Republic. The hunt had moved from rumor to certainty. And certainty, in Pinkerton's hands, was the beginning of justice. Chapter 4, Into the Counterfeit Den. For weeks Allan Pinkerton had followed faint trails that twisted through Chicago like smoke, Calder's parcels, the whispers of Marcus Vane, the missing paper from mills. The puzzle was forming, though its edges still blurred. What he needed now was not another rumor or another wary banker's testimony. He needed to see the press itself, to stand where ink and steel plates birthed their false children. That meant going under disguise. He selected the character with care, a disillusioned laborer, broad-shouldered from honest toil but hungry for an easier road. He let his beard grow wild, purchased a coat with worn elbows, and left his boots scuffed. In saloons he drank just enough to appear careless but never enough to dull his senses. He allowed his speech to roughen, his stride to slacken, his eyes to harden into the watchfulness of a man willing to bend law for coin. Patience rewarded him. At a tavern near the river, he befriended a petty thief named Cullen, thin, nervous, with fingers that twitched like they sought pockets even when none were near. Pinkerton, under his guise, spoke of a weariness with back-breaking work and a desire for better wages with less sweat. Cullen, eager to prove himself connected, leaned in with a sly smile. You want easy coin? There are men who can give it. Fine coin too, better than what the banks hand out. All you need is the courage to carry. Pinkerton kept his voice low. I don't fear silver. Who are these men? Cullen's eyes darted to the door before he whispered, friends outside Joliet. They've got away with presses. You carry their notes into the city, trade them, live like a gentleman. Safer than breaking locks, I'll tell you that. Pinkerton feigned hesitation, then let greed edge into his tone. Introduce me. So it was that 2 nights later, bundled against the cold, Pinkerton climbed into a wagon beside Cullen. The road to Joliet stretched long and rutted, the stars hidden by cloud. They passed farmhouses shuttered tight, dogs barking faintly as wheels crunched the frozen ground. Cullen spoke little, chewing at his nails. At last he muttered, keep your mouth shut and your eyes sharp. These men don't forgive curiosity. They turned down a narrow track lined with skeletal trees. At its end stood a farmhouse, squat and weathered, lantern light leaking from its cracks. To any passerby, it seemed ordinary. But Pinkerton's ears caught a different music, the faint thrum of machinery beneath the floorboards, steady and unnatural for a farm. The counterfeit heartbeat of a hidden press. Inside, the air was thick with oil, ink, and the metallic tang of steel. A dozen men moved with the precision of craftsmen, one fed paper into the press, another stacked sheets, another examined each note by lamplight. On a table lay plates engraved with fierce exactness, their surfaces catching the glow like dangerous mirrors. Pinkerton's eyes swept the room, committing everything to memory. Barrels of paper stacked near the wall. Ink pots labeled from mills back east. Tools sharp as scalpels. And there, watching with cold pride, stood a man he recognized from descriptions alone, Marcus Vane. His hair was silvering at the temples, his eyes bright with a craftsman's arrogance. "You bring us a recruit, Cullen." Vane's voice was smooth, cultured, a surprising refinement for a man running a criminal press. Cullen nodded. "He's eager, and he keeps his mouth closed." Pinkerton bowed his head slightly. "I've worked myself near to ruin with labor. If there's a better trade, I'd learn it." Vane studied him, eyes sharp as Buren's. For a moment Pinkerton wondered if the disguise would fail, if the engraver could carve through his rough beard and see the detective beneath. But then Vane smiled faintly, as if amused by the thought of another man falling under his spell. "Every man deserves reward equal to his skill," Vane said. "Here, we make honest currency dishonest. And dishonest men honest with themselves. Do your part, and the reward will outshine any day's wages." A laugh rose from the workers, more bitter than merry. Pinkerton allowed himself a grunt of approval, playing the role. He spent the next hour watching, pretending to learn but in truth observing every detail. The press itself was a marvel, smuggled from a Cincinnati shop and rebuilt here in secret. The plates bore his telltale flaw, the eagle's wing cut too symmetrically. Bundles of finished notes lay hidden in crates marked molasses and bar iron, destined for riverboats. The operation was larger than he'd feared, more disciplined, almost industrial. This was not a ragged band of rogues, this was a syndicate, precise as a factory. At one point, Vane drew him close to admire a freshly struck note. "Look at her lines," he murmured, pride shining in his eyes. "Sharper than truth itself. Who will question a bill that looks better than the original? The government prints dull promises. I print beauty." Pinkerton forced a crooked grin. "Beauty spends the same as truth, I reckon." Vane clapped him on the shoulder. "Spoken like a man who belongs." But Pinkerton felt only disgust. To him, the note was not beauty but blasphemy, the deliberate poisoning of trust, the quiet theft of confidence itself. A thief might take a purse, but this man sought to unravel the very fabric of commerce. When at last Cullen signaled it was time to leave, Pinkerton allowed relief to remain hidden behind his guise. They rode back toward Chicago in silence. The night seemed darker, as if the stars themselves recoiled from the counterfeit den. In his office before dawn, Pinkerton stripped off the laborer's coat and washed the disguise from his face. He sat at his desk and wrote swiftly, every detail pouring onto the page: the farmhouse location, the press's structure, the barrels marked for shipment, Marcus Vane's pride. He sketched the layout from memory, noting where guards stood, where paper was stored, where the lamplight revealed the flaw in the plates. The evidence was not yet enough for law, but it was more than enough for strategy. The ring could not be struck piecemeal, it must be seized whole, its plates shattered, its leaders in irons. One slip, one premature raid, and the counterfeit notes would vanish like snow in a thaw, only to reappear in another hidden cellar. Pinkerton set down his pen and stared at the lamplight flickering across the counterfeit bill pinned to his ledger. He had stood in the heart of the operation, heard the heartbeat of the press, seen the arrogance of Marcus Vane. The den was no longer rumor but reality. And reality, once seen, demanded justice. Chapter 5, Betrayal in the Ranks. The farmhouse outside Joliet burned in Pinkerton's mind like a lantern left too near dry straw. He had stood in the very heart of the counterfeit den, seen Marcus Vane's gleaming plates, heard the press beating out its false currency like a corrupt drum. Yet knowledge without proof was a knife without a handle. He could not strike without grasping it, and to grasp it carelessly was to be cut. He needed someone inside the ring who could feed him their rhythm. That chance came sooner than expected. On a cold morning he saw the courier again, the same boy who had carried Calder's parcel into the alleys of Chicago. Thin, hardly more than 16, with quick eyes and quicker steps, he reminded Pinkerton of lads who carried messages during the war, too young for danger, too old for innocence. He watched from across the street as the boy accepted another bundle from Calder, this time tucked into a leather satchel. The boy hesitated, glancing both ways before setting off. Fear sharpened his movements. Pinkerton intercepted him at the corner with a quiet word. "You're Samuel, aren't you?" The boy froze, clutching the satchel. "Who's asking?" "Someone who knows you've a brother in Joliet prison," Pinkerton said evenly. "And someone who can see him freed sooner than any counterfeiter will." Samuel's eyes narrowed, suspicion and hope warring within them. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Pinkerton replied, his tone as steady as the river current. "That satchel does not hold muslin or tea. It holds a man's ruin. You're running with wolves, and wolves eat their pups when hungry." The boy looked away, jaw tight. Pinkerton softened his tone. "Help me, Samuel, and you help your brother. You're too young to hang with these men, but old enough to choose better." It took time, long minutes where Samuel's knuckles whitened on the satchel strap. At last, with a tremor, he whispered, "What do you want? Tell me where the parcels go. Who collects them? What you see in the farmhouse. Nothing more." Samuel swallowed hard, but he nodded. That evening in Pinkerton's office, the boy confessed in halting sentences. The satchels went to riverfront warehouses, disguised in crates bound southward. The farmhouse near Joliet was only one of several. Smaller presses existed in barns and mills, all feeding the larger operation. He had seen barrels labeled as molasses, but filled with bundled notes ready to float downriver toward St. Louis. Pinkerton listened, jotting every detail, concealing his satisfaction behind a grave nod. Here was the web he needed. With the boy's help, he could trace every strand to its center. But secrets weigh heavily on young shoulders. Fear eats faster than hunger, and Samuel's fear grew with every errand. Days later, when Pinkerton arranged to meet him in a quiet alley, the boy arrived pale, his eyes darting like a cornered hare's. "They know," he whispered. "They know I've spoken." Pinkerton placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Calm yourself. Tell me what happened." "They asked me questions, where I'd been, who I'd seen. I lied, but Vane, he looked at me as if he could carve the truth from my skin. Please, Mr. Pinkerton, I don't want to die." "You won't," Pinkerton assured him. "Keep to the plan. One more errand, then I'll have enough to break them." But he had underestimated Vane's cruelty. The trap was sprung 3 nights later. Samuel guided him, as agreed, to a warehouse by the river, claiming a shipment was due. The air was sharp with ice, the water slapping against the pilings. Pinkerton entered cautiously, eyes adjusting to the gloom. Crates were stacked high, lanterns unlit. Samuel walked ahead, his footsteps echoing like accusations. Then, movement. Shadows detached themselves from the dark. Men stepped forward, pistols glinting, faces hard. And from behind a stack of crates emerged Marcus Vane himself, calm as a judge. "So," Vane said, voice smooth as polished steel. "The great Pinkerton, led to us by a boy's trembling hand." Pinkerton's jaw tightened. Samuel stood off to the side, shame carved into his features, his satchel dangling uselessly. He had betrayed Pinkerton, perhaps forced, perhaps broken by fear. Pinkerton did not blame him, he blamed the men who had cornered him. "You should have stayed in your office," Vane continued. "We could have lived as ghosts. Now you've made yourself our problem." Pistols raised. Pinkerton moved first. He swung his cane upward, striking the nearest man's wrist. A shot cracked, the ball burying itself in a crate. Chaos erupted, shouts, gunfire, the crash of crates tumbling. Pinkerton ducked behind a barrel, drew his own revolver, and fired twice. One man fell with a cry, another cursed and staggered back. Smoke thickened, acrid and choking. Samuel shouted something, but his words were drowned in the cacophony. Pinkerton seized the moment, driving forward with a burst of fury, his revolver hammering the night. He reached a side door, shoved it open, and plunged into the freezing air of the riverfront. Bullets sparked against the stone behind him, but none found their mark. He ran through the alleys until the gunfire faded, his breath harsh, his coat torn. When at last he reached the safety of a lamplit street, he paused, chest heaving. The trap had nearly sprung shut. Vane had tested him, sought to silence him. But in their haste, they had revealed more than they realized. The crates marked for shipment were filled with notes. The men guarding them were not mere ruffians but organized, drilled. And the barrels, Pinkerton had glimpsed them again, painted with the word molasses, were destined for the river. That meant distribution beyond Chicago, a vein running south to St. Louis. Back in his office, Pinkerton wrote by trembling lamplight, "Counterfeit ring confirmed. Notes shipped in barrels as molasses. Trail leads to St. Louis. Calder laundering, Vane leading. Samuel compromised, yet still valuable. Must protect him if possible." He set down the pen and stared into the flame. The boy had betrayed him, yes, but only because fear had pressed the knife to his back. Vane had shown his ruthlessness. If Samuel lived, Pinkerton could still use him, still save him. If not, he would avenge him. The case had widened beyond Chicago now. The counterfeiters were not content with one city's veins, they sought to poison the bloodstream of the nation itself. And Allan Pinkerton, bruised but unbroken, vowed they would not succeed. Chapter 6, The Web Unravels. The frost still clung to Chicago's cobbles when Allan Pinkerton boarded the southbound train. He carried no badge, no uniform of authority, only his notebook, a revolver discreetly holstered, and the knowledge that Marcus Vane's counterfeit notes were slipping away by the barrelful down the Mississippi. The near ambush at the warehouse had convinced him of two truths: first, that the ring was larger than he had suspected, and second, that Chicago was only one of its mouths. The body of the beast lay further south. The train cut through Illinois farmland, past frozen fields where scarecrows slumped like defeated soldiers. Pinkerton sat with his collar turned up, watching smoke trail into the gray sky, his thoughts busy with Samuel. The boy's frightened eyes haunted him. Was he still alive among Vane's wolves, or had fear driven him beyond saving? Pinkerton forced the question aside. Sentiment had its place, but duty carried the greater weight. By the time the train reached St. Louis, dusk had settled over the river. The city breathed commerce. Flatboats creaked at the levees, warehouses bulged with goods, and taverns buzzed with rivermen spending their wages before they earned them again. If counterfeit notes flowed from Joliet's farmhouse presses, this was the artery through which they reached the wider world. Pinkerton's first task was to observe. He spent days walking the levees, his eyes missing nothing. He noted which warehouses received shipments from the north, which foremen carried themselves with too much polish for honest labor, which merchants seemed curiously flush with coin. Patterns emerged quickly. Crates marked molasses arrived by wagon, were rolled into a particular warehouse, and left again lighter than before. Men came and went at odd hours, their boots too clean for dock work. The warehouse belonged, at least on paper, to Charles Alcott, a respectable businessman with fingers in trade, timber, and river freight. Alcott's name appeared often in the city's society pages, attached to charitable banquets and political dinners. Yet Pinkerton recognized the mannerisms of a man hiding something, the darting glance, the measured smile, the way Alcott's clerks locked doors too quickly when he approached. Respectability was a cloak counterfeiters loved best. Pinkerton introduced himself under another guise, this time as a purchasing agent for a small trading concern. He called at Alcott's office with inquiries about shipping space, presenting himself as polite but inexperienced. Alcott, tall and broad-shouldered, received him with the magnanimity of a man sure of his position. "You'll find we handle freight more efficiently than any in St. Louis," Alcott said, gesturing grandly to ledgers on his desk. "Grain, timber, molasses, we move it all." Pinkerton let his gaze linger on the word molasses. "A commodity much in demand," he remarked. Alcott smiled thinly. "Indeed. Sweetens every table." But his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, quickly masked. To Pinkerton, it was as loud as a shout. That evening, under cover of darkness, Pinkerton slipped into the warehouse itself. The Mississippi's damp air clung to him as he pried open a side door with careful hands. Inside, the cavernous space smelled of hemp rope and spilled sugar. Crates stood in neat rows, each stenciled with black letters, "Molasses." He knelt beside one, eased a knife under the lid, and pried it open. Beneath a shallow layer of syrup-coated barrels lay bundles of paper notes, bound tight with cord. He lifted one stack and held it to the lantern flame. The eagle's wing gleamed with its familiar flaw, Marcus Vane's silent boast. The bills were fresh, countless, enough to flood entire districts. He replaced them quickly, heart steady, mind racing. The scale of it struck him. This was no rogue press hiding in a lonely farmhouse. This was a syndicate, organized with military precision, financed by men of means, protected by respectability. Calder in Chicago was but a minor channel. The true reservoir of poison sat here in St. Louis, guarded by Charles Alcott and his partners. Pinkerton withdrew, securing the door behind him. Back in his lodgings, he filled pages with details: Alcott's warehouse, barrels marked molasses, bundles hidden beneath syrup, operation disciplined, funded, Vane's plates in active use. His hand did not tremble, but his jaw clenched. Counterfeiters were not only robbing individuals, they were undermining the very stability of trade along the Mississippi. A farmer cheated by false notes might never trust paper again. A merchant bankrupted by counterfeit deposits might spread panic across markets. One ring could wound a nation's confidence more deeply than any foreign foe. Over the next week, Pinkerton mapped the web. He shadowed Alcott to dinner with politicians who praised his generosity. He traced couriers delivering crates to riverboats bound for Kentucky. He noted how often Calder's name surfaced in correspondence with St. Louis merchants. The chain was clear: Vane produced, Calder laundered, Alcott distributed. One evening, Pinkerton confronted Alcott directly, visiting his office under the guise of routine business. He watched as Alcott signed papers, his pen gliding smoothly, too smoothly. "You handle much coin," Pinkerton remarked. "A businessman must," Alcott replied with a smile. "And yet," Pinkerton said softly, "too much coin can weigh down a man. Sometimes it drags him into waters deeper than he meant to swim." Alcott froze for a fraction, then forced a laugh. "You speak in riddles, sir." Pinkerton rose, hat in hand. "Perhaps. But riddles often have answers." He left before Alcott could respond, content to let unease fester. That night he met discreetly with local lawmen, men wary of Alcott's influence but willing to hear Pinkerton's evidence. He showed them the counterfeit bills, pointed out the flaw in the eagle's wing, described the barrels in the warehouse. Skepticism wavered, then cracked under the weight of his precision. They agreed to assist, but warned him, Alcott's friends in politics might shield him. A sting would need to be clever, decisive, undeniable. Pinkerton understood. To strike at Vane's ring, he would need not only courage but cunning. The counterfeiters had woven their web carefully across state lines, binding criminals to merchants, merchants to politicians. To unravel it, Pinkerton must pull the right thread at the right time. As he extinguished his lantern that night, the Mississippi's current roared faintly outside, carrying boats heavy with honest cargo, and perhaps, barrels of false wealth bound to poison another city. Pinkerton lay awake, his mind already shaping the trap. He would not merely raid a warehouse. He would lure the spider into his own web. The counterfeiters had grown bold. Too bold. And Allan Pinkerton was ready to make their confidence their downfall. Chapter 7, The Sting Operation. The counterfeiters believed themselves clever, wrapped in layers of secrecy and respectability, but Allan Pinkerton knew arrogance often left a door unlatched. His plan was simple in outline, complex in execution: lure the counterfeiters into exposing themselves with a shipment too tempting to resist, then spring the trap with lawmen waiting in the shadows. He began by crafting false correspondence. With the cooperation of sympathetic Treasury agents, Pinkerton prepared letters bearing forged signatures of political organizers in Kentucky, requesting an immense sum in cash for campaign expenses. The counterfeiters would see opportunity in it, legitimate demand that could be met quickly with their false notes. If Vane and Alcott trusted their own cleverness, they would take the bait. Weeks of patience followed. Samuel, still alive though fearful, served as Pinkerton's reluctant messenger. The boy carried the forged request to Calder in Chicago, who in turn forwarded it southward. Pinkerton shadowed each movement, careful to keep unseen. At last, confirmation came: Alcott himself would oversee the shipment from St. Louis, with Vane arriving to inspect the quality of the notes before release. It was more than Pinkerton had hoped for, both the engraver and the financier, drawn into one place by their greed. The night of the operation was cold, the river stiff with ice at its edges. Pinkerton met with federal marshals and a cadre of trusted local officers in a warehouse near the levee. Maps were spread upon a barrel, lanterns shaded. He gave orders with crisp precision, his Scottish burr sharpening in moments of emphasis. "Men will conceal themselves along the east wall," he instructed. "2 by the loading doors, 2 on the catwalk. No gunfire unless fired upon. We need them alive, their plates intact, the proof undeniable. Tonight we cut the head from this serpent." The marshals nodded, grim and eager. Pinkerton turned last to Samuel, who stood pale and trembling. "You need not go further, lad," Pinkerton said. "You've done enough." But Samuel shook his head. "If I stop now, they'll find me anyway. Better I see it finished." Pinkerton placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stay close to me, then. Fear is a weapon they use, do not hand it to them." Shortly after midnight, the counterfeiters arrived. Wagons creaked to a halt outside the riverfront warehouse. Lanterns bobbed as men unloaded crates marked molasses. At their head strode Charles Alcott, his broad shoulders wrapped in a fur coat, his expression calm with the assurance of untouchable wealth. Behind him came Marcus Vane, his sharp eyes gleaming with a craftsman's pride. In his hand he carried a small case, no doubt containing tools or fresh plates. The men moved inside, unaware of the trap coiled around them. Pinkerton watched from the shadows, his pulse steady. Vane knelt by a crate, pried it open, and withdrew a sheaf of notes. He held one to the lantern, examining the eagle's wing with a satisfied smile. "Perfection," he murmured. Even the Treasury itself could not improve it. Alcott chuckled, clapping him on the back. "Then to Kentucky they go. By the time their politicians spend them, the bills will be everywhere, untouchable." That was the moment Pinkerton chose. He stepped forward, revolver drawn, his voice carrying authority sharper than any bullet. "Gentlemen," he said, "the game is ended. You are in the custody of the United States." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then chaos erupted. One of the counterfeiters swore and reached for a pistol. Shots cracked, echoes thundering through the rafters. Marshals surged from the shadows, their revolvers barking. Men shouted, crates splintered, lanterns swung wildly. Pinkerton advanced, firing once to shatter the pistol of a man who leveled it at him. Alcott staggered backward, shock plain on his face. Vane, however, did not falter. He darted toward the rear door, clutching his case of plates like a priest saving relics. "Vane!" Pinkerton shouted. He leapt after him, boots pounding the boards. The engraver shoved aside a barrel, swung the door wide, and ran into the night air. Pinkerton pursued, revolver raised. The chase tore across the frozen yard, breath steaming, boots sliding on patches of ice. Vane ran with the desperation of a man who knew his freedom weighed less than the steel in his hands. Pinkerton closed the distance, every stride an oath that he would not let this man vanish again into shadows. At the edge of the river, Vane spun, pistol flashing in his hand. Pinkerton dropped low as the shot cracked, splinters leaping from a crate beside him. He fired once in return. The ball struck Vane's shoulder, spinning him sideways. The case fell from his grasp, clattering open to reveal gleaming plates, the false wings of counterfeit eagles. Vane collapsed to his knees, clutching the wound, eyes burning with fury. "You can't stop it," he gasped. "Others will rise. Money is only ink and lies." Pinkerton strode forward, revolver steady. "Then tonight we erase yours." He gestured to the marshals rushing up. "Take him." Back inside, the fight was over. Alcott stood in irons, his fine coat torn, his face pale. His men lay bound or groaning. The crates of false currency were stacked against the wall, silent testimony to the scope of their crime. Pinkerton surveyed the scene, his eyes lingering on Samuel, who stood shaken but alive. The boy had survived the storm, though scars of fear would linger. Pinkerton gave him a nod of respect, silent thanks for a courage born of desperation. The marshals carried Vane in, his wound bound hastily. His case of plates lay on a table, the tools of his treachery finally exposed to the law's light. Pinkerton picked up one plate, running a finger along the engraved lines. So fine, so precise, and yet flawed. The eagle's wing, too perfect in its symmetry, had been the thread unraveling the web. He set it down with a finality that echoed louder than the gunfire. The counterfeiters' arrogance had lured them to their ruin. Their beauty, their perfection, had betrayed them. As dawn broke over the Mississippi, the counterfeit ring was no more. Yet Pinkerton knew his work was not ended. Others would try again, for greed was a crop that never failed to sprout. But for now, justice had teeth, and they had bitten deep. Chapter 8, Justice and Aftermath. The trial of Charles Alcott and Marcus Vane opened in the spring, drawing crowds that filled the courthouse steps before the doors were unlocked. Merchants, bankers, and laborers alike pressed forward, all eager to see the faces of the men who had nearly undone the trust upon which their livelihoods depended. Newspapers from Chicago, St. Louis, and even New York dispatched correspondents, their columns fat with speculation. Allan Pinkerton attended each day, his notes neat, his gaze steady. He had no taste for spectacle, but justice required a witness, and he intended to see it through. The courtroom was a theater of contrasts. Alcott, the respectable merchant, arrived each morning in a carefully pressed suit, chin high though his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. He whispered constantly with his attorneys, men of polished words and polished shoes. Vane, by contrast, seemed less a defendant than an actor at the final act of a tragic play. His shoulder was bound from the wound Pinkerton had dealt him, but his posture was erect, his expression one of scornful pride. He met each witness with a gaze that seemed to say, "You may condemn me, but you cannot diminish my craft." The evidence, however, was crushing. Treasury agents displayed the plates recovered from his case, laying them before the jury like relics of a profane religion. Bank tellers testified to the counterfeit bills' near perfection, pointing out the tiny flaw in the eagle's wing that had betrayed their falsehood. Marshals described the sting at the warehouse, the crates marked molasses bursting with bundles of false notes. When Samuel was called to testify, the room fell silent. The boy's hands trembled as he took the stand, but his voice, though thin, carried clearly enough. He described the errands, the parcels, the nights he had spent in fear. He confessed his betrayal of Pinkerton, eyes lowered in shame, but added that it had been forced upon him under threat of death. Pinkerton watched the jury. He saw sympathy flicker in their faces, and relief softened his own features. Samuel might yet be spared the full weight of the law. Alcott's defense leaned heavily upon his respectability. His lawyers painted him as a victim of misplaced trust, a businessman deceived by unsavory associates. Yet Pinkerton knew, and the jury seemed to know, that the locks on Alcott's warehouse had not turned themselves, nor had barrels of false currency rolled inside without his consent. Vane's defense was stranger still. He admitted freely to his work but framed it as artistry. "What is currency?" he demanded in a voice that rang through the chamber. "Paper, ink, a promise backed by nothing but confidence. I gave the people paper and ink finer than the government's own. If you call me criminal, then you condemn beauty itself." The jury did not need long deliberation. Alcott was found guilty of conspiracy and fraud, Marcus Vane guilty of counterfeiting and treason against the currency of the United States. Sentences were pronounced with gravity, years of imprisonment for Alcott, hard labor, for Vane, a longer confinement, his engraver's hands now destined for chains rather than burins. The courtroom murmured, some voices satisfied, others unsettled by the severity. Vane only smiled, as though prison were another stage on which his pride could posture. Outside, reporters swarmed Pinkerton for statements. He gave them none beyond a few firm words, "The dollar is the nation's promise. To counterfeit it is to strike at the heart of every man's labor." This case proves that the law has eyes sharp enough to see through even the finest lies. The papers the next day called him the defender of honest coin. Merchants praised him in their ledgers, bankers in their parlors, grocers in their small shops. Yet Pinkerton felt no triumph, only the sober satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. In the weeks that followed, Samuel was quietly released into Pinkerton's care. The boy, freed from the counterfeiter's shadow, began clerking in the detective's office, learning to sharpen pencils and copy reports. Pinkerton treated him sternly but not unkindly, knowing that the lad needed discipline to replace fear. One evening, as Samuel sorted files, he asked softly, "Do you think men like Vane will always exist?" Pinkerton considered before answering. "As long as men desire wealth without work, yes. But as long as others are willing to stand against them, they will not prevail." He left it at that, but his thoughts wandered deeper. He remembered the grocer on Lake Street, ashamed of passing a false bill he had not made. He recalled the banker's reluctant admiration for the engraver's skill. He pictured the barrels marked molasses, their sweet disguise hiding bitter treachery. Counterfeiting was more than a crime, it was a betrayal of trust, the invisible chain binding strangers in commerce. Break that trust, and a nation staggered. Weeks later, Pinkerton walked again along Chicago's streets. The winter had given way to spring, shop windows filled with fresh wares, merchants called cheerfully, children ran shouting with pennies in their fists. The city pulsed with confidence, unaware of how narrowly it had escaped poison in its blood. Pinkerton paused outside the grocer's shop where the first false note had been placed upon the counter. The man greeted him warmly, and Pinkerton allowed himself a rare smile. Back in his office, he pressed the counterfeit bill once more between the pages of his ledger. He kept it not as a trophy but as a reminder. Every case, however large, began with one uneasy detail, a dollar that lay too confidently, a merchant who prospered too quietly, a rumor that whispered too insistently. The detective's duty was to listen, to see, to follow the faintest flaw until the whole deception unraveled. As he extinguished his lamp, Pinkerton reflected that thieves who stole purses could be hanged, but counterfeiters sought to steal something greater, the faith of a nation in its own word. That was why he had pursued them into their dens, across states, through smoke and shot. And that was why he would pursue the next villain with equal resolve. The press had been silenced. The plates lay locked in evidence. Marcus Vane's flaw in the eagle's wing would never deceive again. For Allan Pinkerton, the case was closed. But the war against deceit, the endless war for trust, would never be.